computer. Oh, there you go.
Yes, I've got that going. Thank you so much. All right, we are recording now and we're live for the second meeting of the Future of Severance Taxes and Water Funding Task Force. I'll just briefly walk through the agenda here before we get started. We'll do a brief introduction of the research team at the Colorado Water Center at CSU, who's our third party helping us and helping this task force with this report. We'll spend some time hearing from experts at the DNR, CWCB, and Department of Local Affairs about how we currently use severance tax revenue at the state, help give a baseline understanding of, the programs and stakes of the work here, what we're trying to support into the future. Legislative Council staff, nonpartisan staff will come and talk to us about Tabor and the restrictions on raising new revenue. We'll spend a bit of time talking about the next steps for the task force, what the work will look like over the next few months, and then we'll have some time for public comment if there is any at the end. So with that, we'd love to pass it to Karen, and I know you've got team members online from the Water Center and from CSU more broadly. As they're ready to speak, I will make them panelists and would love to hear an introduction and just an overview of how CSU is approaching this work. And please, task force members, feel free to jump in and ask questions and engage with all the different speakers we've got lined up today.
Great. Thank you, Nate. And thank you again, all of you task force members, for participating in this effort. So as Nate was mentioning, as we talked on our first task force meeting, the Colorado Water Center is the third party hired by the Department of Natural Resources to lead the study that's being conducted under SB 25040. And the third party, the purpose of the study that we are conducting, I think we all know this, but just again, we're exploring ways to continue funding water needs and energy impact grants distributed pursuant to Section 3929-110, 1B, I, in the face of decreasing availability of severance tax revenue collected pursuant to Article 29 of Title 39, and to develop related recommendations. So we're really focusing on identifying ways to alleviate the need to transfer revenues derived from severance taxes to the general fund, and to replace severance tax revenue that may have been previously transferred. So as part of that study, as part of our set of deliverables that we're working on, we have firstly a literature review that we will be conducting to look at what has been done in the past. So Colorado's and other states' severance tax policy, water funding policy, and local government funding policy. In addition to really just focusing on the broader picture of water and local government funding for Colorado and other states. That's the literature review side of things. And we intend for that to really be the basis, foundation for what we deliver in the January 15th timeframe. And then additionally, we'll be conducting research on the socioeconomic and policy landscape of water and local government funding in Colorado and other states. This includes kind of more interview options. And so we'll be conducting interviews with the task force, other academic experts, policy practitioners, local government officials, water managers, et cetera, and really using this aspect to define current and future expected water funding and local government funding needs. And then working with DNR and task force members to really flesh out some policy concepts and solutions to continue funding water needs and energy impact grants in the face of decreasing severance tax revenue. We're also I'm working in partnership with DNR and particularly Nate to help set agendas for this meeting and really think about ways in which we're getting the most out of your expertise and translating that information into our report and also into the questions that we're asking during interviews. And then we're doing a little work compiling resources that will go up on the website and some other more financial and reporting management components. So that's an overview of what is set forth for the Colorado Water Center. And I am working with a wonderful team from CSU to really do the research and the literature review components of this study. And so I will introduce them briefly and they can talk a little bit more in depth about their specific work. So we've got the lead of the research team is Dr. Rebecca Hill. She's an extension professor and an agricultural economist. She's also the Regional Economic Development Institute lead. And then we've got Chris Gomans, who's a professor in the Department of Agricultural Resource Economics, and Tim Komarek, an applied economist that's focusing on urban, rural, and regional economics. He has joint appointments in the Department of Economics and the Office of Engagement and Extension. And then we have our graduate student support, who is Haley Ruchlin, and I may have her last name pronunciation a little incorrect there, helping us compile all the information we need for this study. So I will kick it off to probably Rebecca first, if you want to introduce yourself and define a little further what the work will entail.
Yes, hello. Can you all hear me? It looks like I have audio permissions, but I don't have video permissions. So I'm,
Thanks, Rebecca. I'll work on the video permissions, but please feel free and,
yes.
talk.
Okay. Well, if you all can hear me, I can talk. So Karen did a really good job of setting up kind of the mission and what, oh, just a sec here. I'm getting some invites to do different things.
Thanks all. Sorry for the pause. Just promoted Rebecca to a panelist so that we can all see her. And I'll do the same for you, Chris and Haley as well.
Yes, it kicks us out of the meeting and then we get to come back. So nice to meet everybody and to be able to have my video. Thank you, Nate. Again, my name is Rebecca and Karen did a great job of introducing us and our team. So again, I am an agricultural economist, and I do a lot of work with extension and a lot of work with communities. So I've done a lot of water related studies with communities, looking at different economic impacts of different water related decisions. I kind of wanted to just bring up to you that our plan is, as we work through this, we're going to give you the lit review. We are going to interview everybody on the task force. We will send you the interview questions in advance, but we'd love to learn as much information as we can from you, not only about what your ideas are, maybe creative solutions, maybe solutions that have been thought of in the past or new solutions that people maybe haven't thought of. But in addition to that, just to give you a little heads up so you can start thinking about it, we're hoping that you can help us figure out who else we should be talking to, right? Whether these are experts in the area of water or are they experts in the area of public finance, what kind of areas, other experts should we be talking to? And we're hoping that you can help us build out that sample of people that we interview for this report. So with that, I can open up to questions, but I don't know if Chris is in here, but I'd love to pass it to Chris to talk as well.
I'm here. Thank you, Rebecca. I am Chris Gomans. I'm in the Department of Ag and Resource Economics. I'm a professor there whose research mostly focuses on water, and that includes municipal and industrial water issues, agricultural water issues, and then regional economic analyses related to water. I have some experience working with water boards. I currently sit on a water board, so I understand the importance of understanding kind of the future funding landscape and available resources in Colorado for water projects. And I'm excited to get to learn about all of this and hear what you guys have to say. And I'm excited to work on this project.
Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, Chris.
Haley, did you want to introduce yourself to the team as our graduate student that's working on the project?
Hi, my name's Haley Richland. I'm the grad student working with Rebecca and Chris and Tom, and I've taken a few undergrad classes in water law, so I do have a background somewhat in water law. And from all the research I found so far, this seems like a very interesting topic, and I look forward to being in the interviews with all of you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I know, we do not, it doesn't look like have Tim on the line here. But Rebecca or Karen, I'm wondering if you might be able to give just a brief overview of Tim's background, just for folks' context.
Yeah, so Tim is a professor in the economics department, and he does have a lot of background working in some of these different public finance areas. And he's also the co-director of the Colorado Regional Economic Development Institute, and has done a lot of studies for communities as well, and is good with working extension. And so we're really lucky to have Tim with us as well.
Yeah, thanks. We feel lucky to have all of you working on this project. In addition to the task force, we've just got a lot of smart people working on this issue. So just appreciate all of your engagement. And I know you've already conducted one or two interviews and a lot more to come. Recognizing that there's plenty of time for questions and engagement with the Water Center and CSU. I'm curious if the task force does have any questions for Karen or Rebecca, Chris, Haley. Any questions? All right. Well, thank you all for the intros, and yeah, really looking forward to continuing to work with you all. All right. Well, with that, I think we'll move on to our next agenda item, which is focusing on our existing funding scheme. And so we are here to talk about the need to prevent the transfer of revenue away from severance tax funded programs and to potentially find new sources of funding to support those programs. So I think it is very important for this group to all have an aligned understanding of what those current programs are across the DNR and the Department of Local Affairs. And so we've set aside some time, the next 45 minutes, to hear from the three main programs supported by severance tax revenue. So we'll have Carly Jacobs, DNR's CFO, talk through the Severance Tax Operational Fund. Then CWCB Director Lauren Russ will talk about CWCB's funding programs, and Eric Bergman will talk about Department of Local Affairs. And I would say, I think each will sort of run through a brief presentation and just, I think at the end of each of those presentations, I think we can open it up for questions, and we should have ample time. But with that, I will pass it to Carly Jacobs to run through the Severance Tax Operational Fund.
Thanks very much, Nate. Let me just, am I sharing properly? And
You are sharing and we can hear you.
awesome, technology success. That's always a good start to a presentation. So again, my name is Carly Jacobs. I'm DNR CFO. And Nate and Task Force, thanks for the invitation today to talk about one of our major cash funds, the Severance Tax Operational Fund. Now the question is whether I can drive it. There we go. All right, so just taking a big step back and looking at the severance tax that flows to the Department of Natural Resources overall. The severance tax that we receive is to be used for the development and conservation of the state's water resources, as well as for use for programs that encourage sound natural resources planning, management, and the development related to minerals, energy, geology, and water. So that is the statutory purpose of the severance tax that comes to the department. And I suspect this is not the first version of this, or this may not be the last version of this diagram that you see today, but this is a sort of a visualization of how severance tax revenue flows to the different recipient departments. And then DOLA, of course, is on the left and DNR is on the right. And if you see, we get half of total statewide severance tax revenue. And once it arrives in DNR, it is split 50-50 between the CWCB Perpetual Base Fund, which I'm sure Lauren will talk about in detail, and the Severance Tax Operational Fund. So I'm covering the operational fund, and that is the portion of the sort of waterfall of funding that's on the right-hand side in the orange box there. The Severance Tax Operational Fund is a key operating fund for the Department of Natural Resources. It's one of our largest non-enterprise cash funds, or it's among our largest non-enterprise cash funds in the department. And it really is important for sort of our fundamental core operations and functions across 5 divisions in the department. So importantly, it is supporting ongoing programs. So this is, there are some grant programs, but it has significant ongoing operational support, including for about 160 permanent FTE across 5 divisions. So it's very important for DNR operations. And it also funds 2 programs that are outside the department at the Colorado Department of Agriculture and the Colorado Geological Survey at the Colorado School of Mines. So quite a wide reach in the department. For the programs that get severance tax within DNR, their operational fund appropriations are very significant to their operations. In terms of the total obligation for the fund, it's approximately $105 million in total annual obligations. And those obligations fall into two buckets. First, we have our annual program appropriation. So these are the dollars that we spend on operations every year. And that's about $35 million across all of the programs supported by the operational fund. And then the other piece is a 200% statutory reserve requirement, which when you double it, gets to about $70 million. This is a requirement or a directive that we maintain a reserve that's equal to 2 times the current annual appropriations. So that is the other piece of the obligation. So when you add those together, you get about 105 million sort of total portfolio in the fund. But I will point out that, although average severance tax is maybe not, certainly not reliable, if you think about getting about $40 million in severance tax each year, we have 35 million in annual obligations to actually spend each year. If we get less than 35 million in new revenue each year, that requires reserve spending. So that's kind of how that relationship works. I'm going to spend most of my time on this slide. This is the breakdown of that 35 million in obligations for the current fiscal year. And you can see that it is a wide variety of programs across all of our divisions. And I'll just start working my way through what we fund. First, within the Executive Director's Office, we have the Colorado Strategic Wildfire Action Program, which provides grants to support wildfire risk reduction efforts and protect life, property, and infrastructure. And I guess I'll note now and all the way through that almost all of these programs have some sort of intersection with water issues. For COSWAP, that is their mitigation efforts are directly connected to watershed health, and they support projects that protect critical infrastructure in high priority watersheds. And I'll just note that they made $4.8 million of landscape resilience grants in 2025 in partnership with the CWCB Wildfire Ready Watersheds program for risk reduction projects. So that's a significant and important investment in wildfire mitigation. We also have the Species Conservation Trust Fund. That funding is usually split roughly equally between Colorado Parks and Wildlife and the Colorado Water Conservation Board. That fund was created to support projects that improve the environment for species that have either been listed or are candidates for listing as threatened or endangered, either in state and federal status. So, like I said, so these are species conservation projects across both of those divisions. But like I said, about half of that funding goes to water-related species conservation projects, like habitat improvement projects to recover threatened and endangered fish and other studies.
Hey, Carly, sorry to
Oh,
interrupt.
I'm so sorry. I didn't even see your hand.
No, you're fine. I didn't raise it. I'm just interrupting you.
Yeah.
Your graph here, the pie chart is one chunk of money and then plus the 14.7 million on the right.
Yep.
So these are two pies.
Yes. So the distinction, and that's thank you for pointing that out, Brian. The distinction between the pie and the list. The pie are often called, or you may hear them called core programs. Those are the DNR division operations for the most part. The programs on the right-hand side of the slide are more of our one-time grant programs. So you'll see COSWAP on the right-hand side. They make grants. Species Conservation Trust Fund has annual project allocations. So those are allocated under a separate piece of legislation. So Senate Bill 181. So that's the distinction between the two.
Thanks. That
Yeah.
helped me follow along.
Okay. So we have the Avalanche Information Center, which severance tax from the operational fund supports their backcountry forecasting program, which provides information and education to support outdoor recreationists when they're out in the backcountry in the winter. We have two divisions that actually regulate the industries that create or provide severance tax. That's the ECMC and DRMS, Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety. So for ECMC, the operational fund supports approximately 30% of their sort of major operating appropriation in support of their mission to regulate the development and production of oil and gas, geothermal resources, and to capture the capture and sequestration of carbon and underground storage of natural gas in a manner that's protective of public health, safety, and welfare. This includes things like field inspections, complaint response, enforcement, permitting, and environmental studies for about 46,500 active oil and gas wells. And then the Division of Reclamation, Mining, and Safety uses severance tax to regulate active coal and mineral mines and ensure those mined lands are reclaimed to beneficial use. But it's also important to note that that funding supports safeguarding and reclamation activities at abandoned or inactive legacy mine sites, which can affect or are affecting approximately 1,300 miles of streams. So there's certainly a water connection in the DRMS. Colorado Parks and Wildlife uses the chunk, the gray chunk in the pie on the left to support state park operations at our state parks. And that's general operational money. But they also have the Aquatic Nuisance Species Program on the right, which is a $4 million annual investment that supports all waters of the state from to prevent the invasive species, aquatic species. So for the prevention of invasive species like quagga mussels and zebra mussels. CWCB, I will go quickly since Lauren is up after me, I believe, but their primary appropriation on the left includes water management projects and programs that align with the division strategic plan and the Colorado Water Plan. And then last but not least, we have the Soil Conservation Program in the Colorado Department of Agriculture. That's $700,000 a year for grants to the state's 74 conservation districts for on-the-ground conservation projects, and operational funding for the Colorado Geological Survey at the School of Mines, which does a considerable amount of work on groundwater. So as you can see, the operational fund supports key functions in the Department of Natural Resources across a wide variety of programs, quite a few water connections woven throughout that funding. Oops. Apologies, my earphone just made a break for it. But operationally significant across the board. One other note that I need to make is that the operational fund supports water in one additional very important way. Like I mentioned, the operational fund has a 200% reserve requirement. And that was intended to insulate these programs from the revenue volatility that we see in severance tax. But in years where there is sufficient revenue to meet program obligations and maintain a full reserve, all remaining unobligated revenue above and beyond that reserve spills over or is directed to spill over by statute into the perpetual base fund, which adds capacity and funding available for water projects loans. So that's a really important dynamic between those two cash funds. And really quickly, just to speak to why we're here, I wanted to note some factors that affect our fund management strategies for the operational fund. We have near-term revenue volatility on a number of different scales. One is on a month-to-month scale, so it's important to note that in general, severance tax revenue collections are not evenly distributed across the fiscal year. They come in actually mostly in the month of April. So a full quarter of all severance tax revenue that's collected comes in the month of April because tax filing deadlines are the same for us and for the oil and gas producers that provide severance tax. And that is key in terms of our operational approach because you need to have enough in the bank at the end of the year in order to get through those thin months at the beginning of the year when you start to spend. There's also year-over-year volatility, which we know comes from sort of the basic volatility inherent in the oil and gas commodity markets and the structure of severance tax itself that amplifies that volatility. This can lead to a huge fluctuation in revenue from year to year, which is always a planning challenge and makes that reserve critically important for sustaining these operations on an ongoing basis. There's also annual budget balancing actions. And since severance tax is subject to TABOR, as we'll hear about later, the General Assembly has looked at severance tax cash funds to support budget balancing options or budget balancing actions periodically over the last 20 to 25 years. Historically, most sweeps from DNR cash funds have come from the perpetual base fund. The operational fund has actually more frequently required transfers into the fund to maintain solvency in response to extreme revenue volatility. But over the past few years, we've seen some budget balancing activity affect the operational fund, including about $25 million in sweeps over the past few years and another $22.6 million in legislative transfers out for other purposes. So those are kind of the near term, shorter term factors that affect our day-to-day, year-to-year management of the operational fund. And of course, we also have longer term revenue changes related to the oil and gas production that Nate mentioned and our purpose for being. So just wanted to note those as significant operational factors when we're looking at managing the fund. And I think that about does it for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Carly. Any questions for Carly from the group? Steve, jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Carly. That was very helpful. A couple of quick questions, and maybe you answered them, I missed it. But first, the 200% reserve fund that you've got, how can you spend that fund? I know you say to up the operational fund and spill over into the perpetual base fund. Are there other ways you can spend money out of that?
So the reserve is intended to essentially backfill the operational fund when we don't have enough new revenue coming in, right? So if we have a really low revenue year and we don't meet that $35 million in sort of key baseline obligations, we would pull dollars out of the reserve to make sure that those programs have an ongoing sustainable source of revenue. So we can't, these are permanent staff, these are basic functions and ongoing operations for the department. So that's the first way the reserve is used. And then by statute, if we have fully met that reserve requirement, we have enough revenue in the fund that equals that 2 times current year appropriations. Everything else by statute is directed into the perpetual base fund. That's not to say that statute isn't occasionally adjusted or that, revenue that gets pulled out of the fund sort of falls below that. But those are the two main directions that the reserve supports.
But the executive branch DNR can't pull money out for other reasons than you just mentioned. Is that correct?
Correct. That's not without legislative action.
Okay, thank you.
I would also maybe just point out, and Jim, I see you got your hand, want to get you in. A reserve of that size, 200%, I would say is relatively atypical across state government.
I think it is exclusively atypical.
Yeah.
I think we're the only ones.
And I think it reflects sort of primarily, obviously, a lot of legislative and executive thought has gone into that, but I think reflects both the operational importance of the staff and programs supported by the operational fund and the volatility of the revenue stream. And so designed to very carefully insulate those positions. So Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Carly. That was good. I was wondering, this is kind of in line with Brian's question.
Yeah.
You had your pie chart and then you had the plus the other things. Those plus other things, the aquatic nuisance species and those, is that an annual appropriation that can be changed, or is that statutorily required that you put $5 million in the Species Conservation Trust Fund and the rest?
So the species conservation, well, all of these on the right-hand side live in the long bill currently. So for those of you that have been tracking the operational fund for a long time, these used to be called tier 2 type transfers. That might sound familiar. They used to be statutory, so they were made according to statute. After the operational fund was reorganized in the last couple of years. Those have moved into the long bill process. So you will find 5 million for Species Conservation Trust Fund, 4 million for aquatic nuisance species in the DNR budget bill. So they're technically appropriated. Those appropriations essentially behave the same way as a statutory transfer. They move money from the operational fund to these other funds. But you're correct, they are actually, in a technical sense, appropriated now each year, annual appropriation.
Are they required though statutorily to put 4 million in aquatic nuisance fund?
The aquatic nuisance species is an authorized recipient of severance tax.
Okay.
And the statute says up to 4 million.
Okay.
So technically the allocations could change if budget writers made a different decision.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Good question, Jim. Any other questions for Carly?
So on the reserve calculus, has that, is that something we should be playing around with? Is that a no-go? Is that, if we increase the reserve, if we decrease the reserve requirement, does that, help or hurt? What's your take on it, Carly?
The reserve has been the subject of a lot of discussion over the past while. It used to be 100%. We had a year that demonstrated the real importance of having more than 100%. We had a very low severance tax year. And remember, I was talking about that cash flow issue, getting us from one year to another. If you spend all of your reserve down in a current year, you've got nothing left in the tank. And so to get you through the next little while. And that's when the reserve was up, increased to 200%. So the reserve is really an internal, so first of all, critically important. So let's just sort of stipulate to that. But it's an internal fund management tool. And it's not always full. A 200% reserve, I think, I'm not sure anyone expected that to fill completely up, but we had a couple really big revenue years that filled up that reserve for a little while, but it's not full anymore. And I think it's important. It is certainly important from a day-to-day management, fund management perspective. When it comes to thinking about sort of the future trajectory of severance tax in general, it's very specific to the fund. So I guess I would say that it may not be as productive a target for consideration in the context of that question and that charge.
I would agree with Carly and maybe just add that I think recent task forces or work groups on severance tax have focused a lot on the tax policy and the structure of the funds. I would go back to the legislative charge here, which is to continue to fund water needs and grants to local governments and to avoid using severance taxes to revenue to backfill the general fund. And I think if there's tweaks like in those specific frames that could make sense, I wouldn't want to limit the task force from considering them. But my general take aligns with Carly's that our charge is a little more focused on either new revenue or sort of insulating severance tax from the general fund. So again, don't want to be limiting to what the task force could consider, but that's how I read our charge.
Yeah, that's certainly fair, Nate. I would agree with that. And also just Brian, just to note, a significant fund balance like that is difficult to maintain when the statewide budget situation is challenging. So
Jim, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, it just seems like if we did lower the back down to 100% and then things started spilling over into the perpetual base fund, then that would just be a place that they could steal what used to be in reserve to backfill the budget. So it almost seems better for us, even though it seems pretty high, that it would be better to keep it in there. At least we would have enough for the operations of the DNR that way.
Yeah, the key purpose of the reserve is to make sure that we, our permanent staff aren't subject to the, year over year ups and downs, which I know we've all seen that graph. That's very hard if you're stuck with just that. So that's really the intent of the reserve.
But I also think really important to understand as we get further into this process and are looking at a needs assessment and a gap, assuming a really stable source of revenue, the needs in the operational fund are $35 million a year. On the books, it's showing as over 100 because of the need for that reserve. But I think just a really important point for this group to understand going forward. All right. Did you have anything else you wanted to share, Carly, or any other questions for Carly? Great. Lauren,
Thanks
you
all.
ready to give us a CWCB funding overview?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Lauren Ress. I'm the director of the CWCB. And I'm sorry I don't have slides. You're gonna have to just look at me talk. But I am planning on kind of walking through the CWCB overview two-pager. Nate, everybody has access to that shared drive, correct?
So this is maybe a good time. I'll discuss
Oh,
this in next steps too, but we
okay.
have a list of documents that we are getting ready to share on the website. A
Okay.
big focus of us on our website is accessibility so that folks with disabilities can access those documents. And many of those documents are not currently accessible. So we're working on making them so before they are posted to the website. That
Okay.
will hopefully be soon. But
Okay,
Carly,
well,
or sorry.
one of those documents will be a CWCB funding overview that'll provide a little bit more detail and background, but I'm going to kind of talk through it at a high level, and I'm happy to take questions, of course. So the CWCB, and many of you are probably familiar with how some of our funding programs work. You either have a loan or a grant through one of our programs, but we have, I would say, primarily three main funds now. The first is the construction fund that was created in 1971 by the legislature to provide low interest loans for water projects and to provide some funding for additional grants. We used to call them non-reimbursable investments, which is just a fancy term for grants. And that fund is a revolving loan fund that basically allows us to operate without general fund from the state. So revenues come from interest earnings and from royalty distributions from federal mineral leases into that fund. And then another fund that we sort of operate in tandem with the construction fund is the severance tax perpetual base fund that Carly mentioned. That fund was created a little bit later in 1997. And as Carly mentioned, receives 25% of severance tax revenues. It also operates as a revolving loan fund that receives revenue from interest earnings from severance tax. And then we can transfer funding or have been required to use funding from that account to also fund our WSRF or Water Supply Reserve Fund grant program, which is the primary program used by our 9 basin roundtables throughout the state. So from the perpetual base fund, we fund loans and also fund grants to the tune of about $3 million a year, divvied up amongst our 9 basin roundtables. And also use that fund. We're statutorily directed to use that fund for our Interbasin Compact Committee at a much lesser amount. So those of you that are familiar with the legislature know about our annual water projects bill. That is the mechanism for how we award grants over $10 million out of both of those funds that requires legislative approval. And then every year we also have roughly $20 million available from the interest earnings generated by those accounts that we can put towards projects bill grants, we call them. And so every year, this is kind of a big omnibus appropriations bill that funds all kinds of programs and projects throughout the CWCB, loans over $10 million, and then also these project spill grants that don't really have a good home in other grant programs throughout CWCB. Every year we have about 40 to $50 million available for new loans. That varies. Severance tax, as Carly mentioned, is really volatile. The construction fund in fiscal year 23-24 received about 101 million, and the severance tax perpetual base fund received 85 million from severance tax revenue. The third fund that I wanted to talk about that has grown quite a bit over the last few years is our water plan implementation fund. And this is the fund that receives revenue from sports betting, from taxes on the revenue generated through sports betting from Prop DD. Brian was involved in those, in that ballot initiative that legalized sports betting in 2019. That fund has grown pretty significantly over the past few years. Initially, it generated about $15 million a year. And now we're seeing close to $30 million with projections in the next few years, upwards of $50 million. So that's really exciting. The funding for that program is statutorily directed to go to 5 categories. And so we are fairly limited in how we can use that funding within the categories: water storage and supply, conservation and land use, engagement, innovation, agricultural projects, and watershed health and recreation. We do require for construction projects that those have a 50% match, and for other types of projects, we have a 25% match requirement. So it's really used to leverage other partners' funding to meet the goals and objectives of the water plan. I think if there's anything else. Is there anything else you want me to touch on, Nate? That's kind of the high level CWCB funding programs. We have a number of sub-grant programs that are primarily funded through the construction fund and the interest that's generated through those loans. But those are kind of the big ones.
No, I think that's perfect, Lauren. Thank you for the overview. Any questions for Lauren? CWCB funding is a big and diverse portfolio of cash funds. And as Lauren mentioned, that overview of CWCB funding document will be posted on our website soon. And I will make sure that our distribution list knows when that website has been updated to share all this.
Oh, I know one or a couple other points I wanted to mention. Sorry, Nate. Just in terms of how our funding model operates, both our loan program and our water plan implementation cash fund both sort of operate in an arrears model where we take a 10-year kind of running average of severance tax revenues for our loan program and budget based on that to come up with a figure of about $40 million a year available for new loans. And then our water plan implementation cash fund has about a 2-year lag. Revenue collected over the first year is then sent over by the Department of Revenue in September of every year. And then that needs to be appropriated in the next year's projects bill by the legislature to give us the spending authority. And then that's available that following July. So the money that we have that we're awarding grants is based on revenues collected from 2 years prior.
Jim, jump in.
Thanks, Lauren. Good job, even without slides.
Okay, thanks.
So, I was just wondering if sports betting continues to increase like it has been, do you see the need to continue to use it in those 5 buckets, or do you think that it would be useful in other places if it could be tweaked somehow, I guess?
Well, I mean, as I said, it is outlined in statute how we can currently use it. So, there would have to be a statutory change.
Right.
And because it was a ballot initiative that was passed by voters, I guess I'm not sure what that would look like to make changes if we're talking big changes in how those categories were expanded or altered in some way. But I will say that, this last year, the demand that we're seeing come in for those grants is really strong. We usually operate a two cycle grant structure where we have two deadlines. This first grant cycle, we saw all the funding available was requested. It was kind of a record-setting year, but I think that just says that there's still a pretty high demand for the funding that we have available. We're not sitting on a pile of cash that we're struggling to get rid of. So I'm not really answering your question, but
No, that's kind of what I was wondering. I mean, you're right now you're seeing a need for that. I was just thinking you
yeah.
mentioned like it looks like it could go up to 50 million. If we did go up to 50 million, w- w- do you think it would still stay on that trajectory where people are just demanding grants? And maybe since it's free money, they would. I don't know. But I
Yeah, I mean,
was
we just don't
wondering
have a
if it
lot
would
of
be
we
more
don't have a lot of
valuable than
years to look at to, kind of figure out how, what kind of a trajectory we're on. But I think all signs are pointing to there's still quite a bit of demand out there. And we'll see what that looks like when we have
Okay.
more,
No,
data
that's
points to
good.
evaluate. But
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. And Jim, I think that gets to a good question that I'm hoping that we can reflect in our report is, I think the original Colorado Water Plan in 2015, the update in 2023 have done some work in forecasting future needs for water project spending in Colorado. And I think a a summary of that previous work, I think it is something we're expected to be in the report. And so and to the extent this group wants to, I think we can also do some work trying to hone in on what we believe that need to be into the future. And I think this discussion we're having here, I think is just setting that sort of like first brick in that longer term discussion I hope this task force has is what is the need we hope to what is the need we see in the future and how do we fill it, if at all? So thank you. Karen, yeah.
I have a quick question. Lauren, for the sports betting revenue, does that all have to be spent out every fiscal year, or can a reserve be created from that?
yeah, we don't currently have a reserve, but we do, it does carry over year to year. We don't lose it if we don't spend it or grant it.
I will maybe add to that answer, Karen, that because the voters approved Proposition DD, that revenue is Tabor exempt. So it's not counted under the Tabor cap. And so to sweep it into the general fund would bring it into the Tabor cap and sort of hurt the state's Tabor math. So I think that is a key difference in how any excess or holdover money from year to year is treated between many other state cash funds and a voter approved fund like the one Lauren just described. Awesome. Any other questions for Lauren? We can move on to Eric if not. Awesome. Well,
Just
Eric. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
just real quick and maybe to re-ask Jim's question. Um, there are sports betting related activities that could continue to grow. They're talking about casino gaming on your iPad, which, may be a terrible idea or a great idea or, whatever. Uh, Lauren, if that became a thing, is that something where putting it in the water plan implementation cash fund is helpful or handcuffs you, moving forward to take care of all the water needs around the state?
You mean handcuffs me in terms of having to still use that funding for those 5 categories of projects? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, if it does it put too much money into a pot where you're like, okay, now this cup runneth over and this cup empty.
You're never going to catch me on the record saying that we have too much funding for water projects. So
That's good.
it's hard for me to answer that. But I mean, certainly at some point, we're going to run out of, primarily, I would think we would run out of entities capable of doing the projects, right? I mean, I think that there's going to be some kind of saturation at some point. I don't think we're there yet. Um, so I think if and when we get to that hypothetical future where we have more funding than we're able to grant out in a year, then I would certainly think that there are other types of water projects that could use that funding.
Yeah, I mean, Brian, I think you've put your finger on a good question, which is, you know, there are restrictions on what the water plant grant program can be spent for. I think they're quite broad, and I think they allow for a really wide range of projects. But whereas like a non-reimbursable investment made through the projects bill can be anything under the sun that the CWCB and the legislature deems appropriate. And so I think there is inherently less flexibility when you have those, statutory limits on a fund. But I do think it is still quite broad. But I think it's a good question for us to keep in our minds as we go forward.
And I think especially if we're talking about, some future replacement for an existing funding source like severance tax.
Well, with that, we've got Eric Bergman from Department of Local Affairs teed up. And Eric, you should be able to share your screen. And yeah, let's dive in.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Nate. It's great to see everybody. My name is Eric Bergman. I'm Director of the Division of Local Government in the Department of Local Affairs. Got so many friends and old colleagues on this call. It's just wonderful seeing everybody. Commissioner Yan, it's great to see you again. And Lise and some people in the audience out there, Angie Bender and others that I've literally known for 20 some years. So it's great to be here. And I'm going to try to share my screen. I am two with technology. So bear with me. Let's see. Can you all see that?
It's still loading, but it looks like yes, we can see you and we can hear you.
Oh, mine will be very short today, and hard acts to follow with Carly and Lauren doing such a great job. So understanding kind of the DOLA side of severance tax. Let's see if this will prompt. Does this move? Does it move? Oh, hold on. No. Let's see. Sorry, I'm just trying to how to prompt the slides now. Nope. Nope.
It's always a trick,
Oh,
Eric.
there we go. Well, that seemed to do it, but I'm sure I did.
Yep, that advanced it.
So just real fast, local affairs, we're a fairly small agency compared to most of state government. Our mission is basically we are a partner agency to local governments around the state, to cities and counties and special districts. Responsible for strengthening Colorado's local communities through accessible, affordable, and secure housing, implementation of property tax law, increasing capacity building, strategic training, research, technical assistance, and most famously funding to localities. My division alone has on the order of 23 different grant programs. And I will tell you that, there we go. Here's a quick, just a sectional you can see here. We have a division of housing, which is our largest division within DOLA, and then the division of local government that I administer. You can see from that little icon above my division, it looks like I work at Casa Bonita. I wish that was so, but it's not. We also have a division of property taxation, which works directly with our assessors and with our counties around the state on implementing all the property tax changes and the trainings for assessors and whatnot. We have our Board of Assessment Appeals, which hears appeals on property taxation issues. And then finally, we have our State Demography Office, which is one of our most amazing resources for folks out there and a great resource for local governments. So the severance tax itself, this should not come as a surprise to anybody on this task force, but it's a tax imposed upon non-renewable natural resources removed from the earth. It is the irony I said before, we have on the order of like 23 different grant programs within the Division of Local Government. the Energy and Mineral Impact Program, which the severance tax funds, is far and away it's bigger than all of our other grant programs put together, and yet ironically it's also the most volatile funding source of all of our grant programs. So that creates a lot of challenges as far as expectations and um, ability to plan on some of this. This is a variation on a theme that you saw from Carly's slide, showing that separation there. There's an off the top that comes out of the state severance tax revenue for those decarbonization tax credits. And then that remainder flows down 50% to us, 50% to DNR. Over there on the red side, you can see that about 3/4, 70% of that dollars goes into our Energy and Mineral Impact Assistance Fund. That's our grant program. And then the other 30% that comes off, it goes out directly in direct distributions to cities and counties that have either oil and gas permitting, have employees, or other relationships. It's a formula system every year. So right off the top, we take 30% and goes straight back out every fall to local governments throughout the state. That 70% comes down into our Energy and Mineral Impact Assistance Fund. We do have a small diversion there for operations, nothing on the order of DNR, but we do fund a number of positions with severance tax. We have a required, statutorily required reserve we have to maintain of $6 million. We have a number of initiatives that we do on the side that come out of that, such as our Main Street program and our University Technical Assistance program, things like that. And then finally, the lion's share, but though, does go out to local government through our grant program. This fund primarily it's an infrastructure funding machine. We also do a lot of planning, comprehensive planning, facility planning. So if you're planning to build a large wastewater plant, for example, we can fund that planning as well as the construction phase. We do a lot of other housing, climate resilience, and also economic development out of this fund as well. You can see here from our from calendar year 2024, 183 different communities were served and awarded on the about $160 million. Now that was back in calendar year 24. Things have changed dramatically since then. You can see in 25, 76 communities served and about 36 million awarded. Some examples of some of the projects that we're doing. We do a lot of transportation infrastructure, a lot of roads and bridges, like this one bridge in Cedar Ridge. We do a lot of water and wastewater upgrades and systems. This is a water upgrade system in Buena Vista that we did just recently. Solar panels and a microgrid project up in Routt County last year. And then finally, we've been doing the last couple of years, we've been doing a lot of infrastructure that's been enabling large housing projects as part of the More Housing Now initiative from the governor's office. So we've been doing a lot of ability to help these communities establish affordable housing for their workforce to help them as they try to attract new jobs, new employers, and new employees. I mentioned before just how volatile, we keep hearing that over and over again, how volatile this funding source is. You can see this, I call this the roller coaster slide. You can see the blue is the actual net collections, like basically what we're getting at the state level. You can see there in 2016, this was when there was that large, I think it was British Petroleum, this is before I was at DOLA, settlement that happened that most of the severance tax that year went to reimburse that after a legal settlement. Then you can see over in 2021, probably don't have to explain that, but that was the COVID pandemic. No one was driving their cars, so obviously the price of oil took a header, and as a result, production was way down, and of course, so the resulting severance tax was way down. And then you can see just this last year, we experienced our latest little plunge, not so much due to production. Production was pretty much on par, but we did have record high ad valorem tax credits that were issued to the industry, which is in law and part of their right. But they were record high to the extent that they basically almost zeroed out the severance tax for the year. So again, just a lot of up and down. You can see some great years there. Like I said, 2022 bouncing back from the pandemic, we had a record high year. And like I said, then 2 years later, we were back down again um, uh, with a very concerning low. So going forward, we had 3 grant rounds in fiscal year 25. We're going to have probably just one grant round this year. It'll hopefully be announced in about a month or so, somewhere in the $15 to $25 million range. And then again, going forward, the volatility, we are seeing, as has been mentioned before, continued transfers away from the program to help with budget balancing. And combined with the record high ad valorem tax credits issued, created a kind of a perfect storm last year. This summer, following the adoption of the big beautiful bill, we had to go in and another $3 million was taken from the severance, the Energy Impact Fund. Another $10 million transfer is slated for this next budget year. Obviously, the state's actions are trying to minimize disruption of the program while still balancing the overall budget, which we are constitutionally required to do. Again, one anticipated grant round this next year. I will mention that we have got in this state, well, in this nation, an infrastructure crisis. That is not, it's not sexy to talk about, but we are talking about billions of dollars in necessary investment just in Colorado alone. We've got infrastructure in the state that is really, really aged. This photo here, you can see that on the pipe. There's a water line replacement in Meeker. That pipe's from 1930. So it's literally almost 100-year-old infrastructure that we replaced in the town of Meeker with those water lines. I think it's up in Clear Creek County. They have some wooden pipes still that are going back to like mining days. So we very, very pronounced need in this state for continued funding for infrastructure at the local level. This program is part of that solution. We also have, I will mention our CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant program, a federal program that we administer. There's a public facilities portion of that. We get a couple $1 million a year that goes to that. And then also there's the state revolving fund, which does a lot of water and wastewater projects. But those are kind of the three biggies out there that are available to help with these infrastructure projects. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention that our energy minimal impact program is not just severance tax. There's about, I think that accounts for about 3/4 of our energy minimal impact program. The other quarter comes from federal mineral lease dollars, FML dollars, which is a separate pot that comes from production on federal lands, lease payments the state gets. So that also goes into the pot. And there's also a direct distribution aspect on that program as well. But that is a smaller piece of our energy impact program pie. So I think with that, I think that's my last, yeah, it's my last slide. I'm going to stop sharing. Well, I'll continue to share, just not in a technological fashion. I'm happy to answer any questions you guys might have, and thanks for your patience.
Thanks, Eric.
Crickets, crickets.
Yeah. Jump in if you've got questions. Elise, please.
Elise, go ahead.
Eric, do you have the overall total over the last, I don't know, since I'm trying to think what the first year of sweeps were, 2010, 11, that has
we do actually, and thanks for the prompt, Elise. We have a handout that has been provided that once, and I apologize, was just provided today to DNR. So once they get the accessibility issue, it does show all of the various sweeps going back to 2010. Actually, it's funny you mentioned 2010 because that's the year we started. At least on this handout, showing the diversions, the transfers away from the fund. So yeah, you will see that on there. And I do have two of our staff are on the call, Dave Bowman, who's our deputy director, and Victor Chen, who is our kind of our severance tax czar. He's the brain. I think they may know off the top of their head how much. I mean, it's over 100 million. I think more like 100 or 150 over the last 15 years. But don't quote me on that. But it is in the document that we provided, kind of showing. And I should mention, in addition to some of the transfers for budget balancing, there have been other diversions. This last year, there was a bill passed to fund the upgrades to the digital trunked radio program, DTR program, across the state. And that will be pulling out 15 million a year for the next 10 years. So that'll be another 150 million pulled out to fund the digital trunk radio program. So it's not just budget balancing, there's also been some other statutory diversions for other priorities. So good to see you, Elise.
Yeah, thanks for that response, Eric. And this is another piece where, as Eric said, we'll make sure that document is posted to the website, but that is also something I'm expecting will be outlined in some detail in the report, is in our background and history section, sort of what has been happening on the legislative front here over the past few years, both tax policy changes, but also diversions away from all of these severance tax funded sources we talked about.
Other questions? All right. Well, Nate, I'll kick it back to you. Obviously, I'm on the task force. I'll be here for all the week. I'll be here for all the meetings. So if anyone has any questions, please reach out. I'm happy to chat with you. So thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, with that, we've got some guests here to talk to us about Tabor. Really excited and thankful that Elizabeth Ramey and David Hansen from Legislative Council staff have joined us to give us a nonpartisan overview of the state's constraints as it relates to raising revenue. So with that, I'll pass it to Elizabeth. Please introduce yourself and please jump in.
Sure. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Ramey, as you just heard. Can you hear me okay? Good, okay. So I'm here from Legislative Council staff, and I'm here with my colleague Dave Hansen. So we're the nonpartisan economists that part of the team of economists that help the legislature figure out how much money they have to spend throughout the year. We do quarterly economic and revenue forecasts in order to inform the budget. And so one of my responsibilities is monitoring Tabor conditions. And one of Dave's responsibilities is being an expert in forecasting severance tax. So I'm going to just give you a brief overview of Tabor, and hopefully it will have plenty of time for questions, because it's kind of pitched at a beginner level, but I know many of you have already experience with Tabor. So I'll just get started and hopefully answer some questions at the end. So just gonna, oops, I didn't mean to, sorry, share my screen. Okay. So just general overview, what is Tabor? It's the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights, and it was a citizen initiated measure that was put on the ballot in 1992. Sorry, it was put on the ballot before that, but it was passed by voters in 1992, and it amended the Colorado Constitution. So it's Article 10, Section 20 of the Constitution. And altogether, Tabor is a very complex web of policies. But if we look at the overall impact of the provisions taken together, they are intended to restrain the growth of government. And they do that by limiting the manner that governments can increase taxes and the extent to which they can keep the revenue that they collect. So Tabor, in the language of Tabor, it applies only to districts, and that is just the Tabor, the formal term that Tabor uses for a government. And so that becomes important when I show you slides later about enterprises, which are technically not counted as districts. It prohibits certain means of raising revenue, and talk more about that on the next slide. It requires voter approval for other means of raising revenue. And it also includes a Tabor revenue limit or a tax and expenditure limit that, although it has many exceptions, it caps the amount of revenue that a district or government can collect and retain. And it requires that any revenue that's collected above that limit has to be refunded to voters, or else the state or the local government has to ask for permission to keep that revenue. Okay, so specifically, Tabor prohibits there should be no new or increased real estate transfer taxes. At the state level, Tabor prohibits a property tax being imposed or emergency property taxes. At the local level, local governments are not allowed to impose an income tax. And all taxable income has to be taxed at the same rate. So that means no graduated income tax is allowed under Tabor. And in terms of violations, if a plaintiff brings a lawsuit alleging a violation against Tabor and they win, they are entitled to recoup the costs and attorney fees, and also the state or local government that has been found to have collected revenue illegally has to refund that revenue plus 10% interest from when it started doing so for up to 4 fiscal years before the lawsuit was filed. Tabor 4 is the portion of Tabor that specifies voter approval requirements. And so you can see here that these are the 4 main categories for which voter approval is required. The state or local government has to ask voters anytime it wants to impose a new tax or impose a tax rate increase. Also, importantly, a tax policy change that results in a net revenue gain is counted under this category. Although the legislature has, in recent years, passed legislation that has resulted in a net revenue gain without asking for voter approval, and that might be a question for a legal person, but anyway, it's just something to note. The government also has to ask voters to retain any revenue that's collected above the Tabor limit. So, for example, on the ballot right now is Proposition LL, and that is a retention question, asking voters if the government can retain certain tax revenue that was collected. And the government has to ask in order to issue multi-year bonded debt for infrastructure projects. And finally, it should ask permission if it wants to weaken any existing limits on government growth and government revenue. So this is sometimes called debrucing after Douglas Bruce, who was the citizen who initiated the Tabor measure on the ballot. And while there are most local governments have debruced in some form or another since Tabor was enacted in 1992, there's never been a debrucing passed at the state level. Okay, so and Tabor 7 is the portion of Tabor that we also deal with a lot with impacting the state fiscal and budget decisions. The limit on fiscal year spending is the legal term that's used by Tabor. It just means the amount of revenue that is the state or any local government is allowed to keep or either spend or save. We usually call this the Tabor revenue limit or the Tabor spending limit, even though Tabor calls it a spending limit. Okay, so how is the Tabor limit calculated? The Tabor limit base, which applied when Tabor was first passed, is calculated as the prior fiscal year's spending grown by inflation and population growth and any voter approved revenue changes. One example of a voter approved revenue change was Referendum C. Voters approved Referendum C in 2005, and that measure allowed the revenue limit to grow from the highest amount of revenue collected during a 5-year timeout period, starting in fiscal year 2006. And so what happened was that ended up resetting the base year for the cap to fiscal year 2007, 2008. And Referendum C revenue is required to be spent on certain things, including education and healthcare. So because those are most significant parts of the state budget, the Referendum C cap is basically the new Tabor limit cap. And the one that applies is adjusted now for inflation and population each year and applies to the state spending. It's calculated a little bit differently than the Tabor limit base, and it's the prior fiscal year's cap grown by inflation and population growth. That's significant because no matter what happens with revenue, the cap will grow in accordance with inflation and population. So even if revenue happens to decline in an economic downturn, for example, the Tabor limit still grows. Okay, so what type of revenue is subject to Tabor? All revenue is subject to the Tabor limit except for these 11 different specific types. And so the Tabor Amendment specifically exempts 10 of these types of revenue, and then the last one, the special purpose authority revenue, is exempted by statute. So I won't go through each of these, but just for your purposes, maybe call your attention to voter approved revenue, which we already talked about. Intergovernmental transfers are things such as transfers within the general spending account to the reserve and from the reserve to the general spending account. And so when the revenue was collected, it's already been subject to Tabor, so it's not subject again when it gets spent from the reserve or transferred to the reserve. Another thing to note that I'll talk about a little bit more later is enterprise revenue. And like I think I mentioned, enterprises are specifically excluded from the definition of district. So if a government function can be moved into an enterprise and users of that function charged a fee, then that revenue is not subject to the Tabor limit. And I'll talk a little bit more about enterprises in a minute. And special purpose authority revenue is again exempted by statute. Special purpose authorities are statutorily defined as not part of the government. And so this includes things like CHAFA, which is the state's affordable housing authority. That's a special purpose authority. This just gives you an idea of what percentage of revenue is subject to Tabor. As you can see there, of about $64 billion of revenue in fiscal year 24, about 30% of it, or 20 billion, was subject to Tabor, and most of that comes in the form of general fund revenue, and most of that revenue is individual income tax revenue. So the single largest source of taxable of Tabor revenue subject to Tabor is individual income tax. And then just to call your attention, you just heard that severance tax is one of the volatile sources of revenue. And just to point out that it does fall under cash fund revenue subject to Tabor. So this is just showing you a history of Tabor revenue, the Tabor limit base, and the referendum C cap. And then the dark green bars are our forecast for that revenue moving forward. So one thing you can note is that Tabor surpluses have changed. In recent years, they've been rather large, especially in the post-pandemic couple of years. Right after the pandemic, we do expect Tabor surpluses in future years, but smaller than they have been than we maybe got used to in recent years. And notably, in the current fiscal year, because of federal policy changes, uh, mostly if we are expecting a Tabor revenue to come in below the Tabor limit. So this is kind of a new situation for the budget that we haven't experienced for several years. Okay, now, like I said, maybe you want to talk about a little bit more about enterprises. So Tabor applies only to districts, and the Constitution specifically excludes enterprises from the definition of district. So an enterprise is a government-owned business that, so the government is providing a product or services, and it's being provided to users of that product or service in exchange for a fee. Government also enterprises are authorized to issue their own revenue bonds, and they can only receive up to 10% of their annual revenue in grants from state and local governments. So an enterprise is important to consider because it can provide some budget flexibility. It excludes whatever revenue is collected within the enterprise is excluded. It can grow as quickly as it grows. It's not subject to the Tabor limit growth restrictions. And so it also allows some state functions to kind of be spun off. Those that can be user funded can be spun off. It's obviously limited in the cases where you can't really charge users for the state provided service, like K-12 education, if you consider charging children or child welfare programs, for example, it would be difficult to charge users for those particular programs. But if we look at the history of enterprise revenue in relation to other types of state revenue, it has been a rapidly growing type of state of revenue. And so it's an indication that the Tabor Amendment has had the impact of kind of encouraging spinning off some government functions into enterprises. Okay, so finally, just a discussion of Tabor refunds. Districts, governments can use any reasonable method for refunds, including temporary tax credits or tax rate reductions. And refunds don't have to be proportional to what people paid in when it's difficult to identify how to return prior payments of that revenue. And so the state has used over 20 refund mechanisms since Tabor was put into place in 1992. But currently we have five refund mechanisms in use. The first two refund mechanisms involve reimbursing local governments for property tax exemptions that they provide to certain seniors and veterans with disabilities. The third and fourth refund mechanisms, as you can see there, have to do with reducing tax rates if the Tabor surplus is a certain amount. And then the fifth refund mechanism is a sales tax refund. The income tax rate reduction and the sales tax refund, those both just come to you through your tax return when you file it in the spring. From a budgetary standpoint, it's important just to note that in a Tabor surplus situation, anytime we have an increase in general fund revenue, it goes out in the form of Tabor refunds. So it doesn't affect the amount available for the general fund budget. So it's a little bit counterintuitive because you would think if you have extra revenue, you have extra money to spend, but not in the case of a Tabor surplus. In the current fiscal year, in the case where we do not have a Tabor surplus, then the extra general fund money does give extra budget space. But the situation that we've seen mostly in the past few years is a Tabor surplus situation. So just an important thing to keep in mind when thinking about the budget. And then another important thing to keep in mind is that an increase in cash fund revenue in a Tabor surplus situation squeezes the general fund budget because the Tabor refunds are paid from the general fund. So cash fund dollars come in and general fund dollars go out, and then there's less available for the general fund budget in a Tabor surplus situation. So I mentioned that because, as we said, severance tax revenue is cash fund revenue subject to Tabor, and it's been volatile. It's probably the main source of volatility in cash fund revenue subject to Tabor. As you can see here, we do expect cash fund revenue to keep growing, and it has been growing even as we've had these Tabor surpluses. And you can see a little bit of the volatility of severance taxes contributing to maybe some problems estimating and predicting what the general fund situation can be. And with that, I'm finished with my overview. If anyone has questions, we're happy to answer.
That was great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Do task force members have questions?
I guess I have a question, and I feel like I should probably know this, but does being an enterprise provide any protections from like legislative sweeps of funding?
Um, that's a good question. So you mean like the kind of sweeps that of cash funds that they did this year?
Mm-hmm.
Um, I'm not sure. Dave, do you know?
No, I'm not sure either.
I'm trying to think if any of the cash funds were enterprise funds that they swept. I don't think so, but I can look into that and get back to you.
Okay. Carly, do you know?
I,
Sorry to put you on the spot.
I've got a take on the question. I think there's nothing inherent about an enterprise that prevented its revenue from being swept into the general fund. I think it's largely a function of the Tabor math. So in a year where the state's in a Tabor surplus, taking money from a enterprise not subject to Tabor and pulling it into the general fund adds Tabor eligible revenue and may add to that surplus. If, though, the state was under the Tabor cap, moving revenue from a Tabor exempt enterprise into the general fund would grow Tabor eligible revenue, but wouldn't drive a surplus. So I think there's nothing technical that prevents it, but it depending on whether we're above or below the cap, it depends on whether it helps the statewide budget situation or not.
And then another consideration is whether it requires an adjustment in the cap itself. Because if it's moving from an enterprise to the general fund, then it's moving across Tabor boundaries, so it changes the Tabor cap as well. But
Elizabeth, on that,
you might want to invite someone from our legal services staff to answer those kinds of things. So we're really just forecasters.
no, that is really helpful, Elizabeth. Thank you. Would you mind sharing maybe briefly how the Tabor cap is calculated and what the trade-offs are as you just described of sort of what goes into setting that cap each year?
Yeah, so it's calculated by inflation plus the previous year's cap plus inflation and population growth. And the thing about that is those are from the previous calendar year. So there's a bit of a lag between that's a trade-off. So that's one of the trade-offs. So there's a lag between when inflation happens and things get more expensive and when there needs to be budget space for those things. So if you looked at that Tabor outlook chart that I showed you, we had pretty high inflation in 2022, but there's a lag then between when we had the inflation and when it provided more room in the Tabor cap. And so that's the way that we basically calculate it. And then when there's a voter approved revenue change, it changes the cap as well. And like I said, when enterprise, so frequently some of the most significant enterprises are higher education institutions. And some of the smaller ones will disqualify because they don't reach the 10%. They exceeded the 10% limit because they're smaller schools. And so they regularly get qualified and disqualified as Tabor enterprises. And when they do get disqualified, then they get subtracted from the Tabor cap and their revenue gets subtracted from Tabor revenue. But then when they requalify, their revenue gets added and they're added to both the cap and the revenue. So one of the things about creating enterprises is if it's a function that's already being done by the state and it gets moved to an enterprise, you're moving both the cap and the revenue versus if you create a new function or a new user fee, a new function that can be user funded, I'm trying to say, then it has a different impact than if you move something into an enterprise that's already being done. If that makes sense.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It does make sense. It is quite nuanced, though.
Yes. That's
There,
why you need a lawyer. You need a lawyer.
so there was maybe a few years ago a ballot initiative that passed that placed additional restrictions on new enterprise revenue collections. Would you mind covering that briefly if you have that information?
Sure. So that is, let me see, that was
Was
Proposition 117.
I believe so. I was having a hard time
Mhm.
remembering the number, but I think 117 is it.
Yeah, so it was approved in 2020 and it is statutory. So it's not in the Constitution, like the other provisions, but it requires voter approval for a state enterprise to be created if it's projected to have revenue of over $100 million in the first 5 years. So we've seen since then a lot of smaller enterprises being created as a result. Maybe not as a result. I shouldn't say as a result, but I have noticed a lot of smaller enterprises being created since then.
Thank you. Any other?
There's
Oh, go ahead.
a memo that we update, our office updates it every year on state government enterprises. If you wanted to consult our website for more information, it has more information. It lists specific enterprises and when they were created. And I last updated it earlier this year. So it would include everything up to this legislative session.
Thank you.
If you want me to send you that link, I can.
That'd be great. And I'm also planning to ask you to send the link to or a copy of the slide deck that you just shared so that I can share it on our website as well. So,
Sure.
but any other resources that you all produce and would like and think are relevant, I would like to share on our website with our state.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, we have a whole section devoted to Tabor and like several memos on it because it is so complicated. So,
other questions?
Severance tax could be debruced? Question mark.
I don't know if there has been an initiative brought forward or to do that. But yeah, it definitely seems like would need to have voter approval for anything like that. Yeah, I'm not sure there.
And I guess as a follow on, because Nate, you raised a novel concept for me that if something is debruced, then it potentially becomes less attractive for legislative sweep.
Yeah, I think it depends on whether the state is above or below the Tabor cap. It's a question I think we should seek more input on. This is maybe an opportune time to mention, because Elizabeth mentioned a couple times that we might benefit from talking to a lawyer. typically the work of the state executive branch is supported by lawyers from the Attorney General's office. We have been advised that based on the way that this bill was drafted, this is a legislative task force. As such, the Attorney General's office is not able to offer legal support. I still need to work with our Office of Legislative Legal Services to determine whether support could be offered from them. Um, but we may need, as a group, to be creative about how we seek that legal advice. And this felt like an opportune moment to mention that to the group, that that is a question that I am trying to address on behalf of this group.
It's also, an area of evolving case law. So I know there was recently a Supreme Court decision that impacts some of this, what constitutes an increase in tax revenue that's allowable under Tabor. And then there's another ongoing lawsuit. So that probably just makes your job more complicated and probably more complicated to find out how to get, Office of Legislative Legal Services involved. So, but
I would also
And
maybe add that it's not necessarily incumbent on this task force to answer all legal or technical questions related to a given concept. And so I think we should endeavor to answer what we can and account for what we can, but it could always be a recommendation of the task force that um, the legislature or executive branch continue to evaluate a given option based on uncertainties. So another thing for folks to keep in our minds.
And just to throw out there, I don't know to what extent this exists, but there are publicly available legal opinions from the Attorney General. I don't know if they have opined on anything of this nature, but I'm sure there is something relevant to Tabor or enterprises or debrucing that is publicly available.
I don't know if it's relevant, but in the back of my mind, I feel like there was some type of legislation that dealt with what collections for a local government uh, is constituted of. So anyway, I think it was in relation to gaming revenues. So I don't know if that's of interest as well.
yeah, that was recently. So they've kind of expanded some of the categories of excluded revenue. That's another thing maybe to think about. Like Dave said, they have changed definitions of collection for another government, and they've also worked on what constitutes property sales and damage awards for the purposes of Tabor.
Well, this is, if there are any other questions for Elizabeth and David, please jump in. Otherwise, maybe a good segue to a discussion of next steps. But I don't want to stop conversation, so please speak up if you've got other questions. Elizabeth and David, would you be willing to come back at any point in the future and or recommend colleagues from Legislative Council staff that would be good for us to talk to?
Sure, happy to come back. Anything we can do to help, yeah, just reach out and let us know.
Thank you very much
Yeah,
for
we have a
that.
team. I think there are 6 of us, so we have a variety of experts that you can call upon as well. So
Awesome. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time today.
Yeah,
Steve, I
thank
see you off mute. Oh, question or just thanks?
I was just gonna say thanks to them. That's all. So
Great.
David, Elizabeth, thanks.
thank you. Thanks for having us.
Welcome and thank you.
Yeah. Have a great day. Awesome. Well, with that, would love to talk a bit about next steps. So a couple things. We've talked about our website. So right now, that website includes links for folks to submit public comment. It includes a link for folks to sign up for our distribution website. I've had a couple issues with that, but I think ironed out. So folks who have signed up for that list, from here on out, you should be receiving notice of upcoming meetings. You will receive notice when we get documents uploaded there, which I already mentioned, but we are just working through some accessibility issues with that to make sure that everyone can access that content. There have been a lot of presentations put forward already. These first two meetings, those will all be posted. There's also been reference to a lot of documents that I've been keeping track of and saving in a file that will be posted as well. And as we continue on, we'll keep adding to that list. Um, any questions on sort of website maintenance or things the task force would like to see reflected on that aren't? Cool. All right. Next, just want to talk very briefly about a due date coming up in January. So on January 15th, our third party, who we've heard from today already, owes to this task force a draft report. Given the timeline, so our first meeting was held in early October. That report is due just a little more than 3 months later. It has been my goal that that report should reflect background research, literature review, and essentially an outline of the work and content that this task force will produce in the coming months between the January 15th draft and the July 15th final report, which is due to the General Assembly. And so you'll note we will have more time after that draft is due than before to actually work on this. And so I am not viewing that report at all as close to our final product, but rather a starting point for us to continue to work and build off of. I think it also provides an opportunity for this group to really start conceptualizing like what our final product should look like, and we'll have ample opportunity after that time to amend the outline, add content, fill out recommendations. And so I wanted to just hold a little bit of time if folks have thoughts or questions about that January 15th deadline. Again, that is a deadline from the third party to the task force, that it does not necessarily involve transmittal of anything to the General Assembly. But again, want to leave space for this group to discuss if people have thoughts.
Nate, just a quick question. Do you know, is Colorado State folks going to do interviews before that report is due, after, or a mix of both, just timing wise?
I think likely a mix of both. I think many will be done before that time, but I expect that some will take place after that time.
Okay.
I also just, to the extent there are things that you may say in an interview this month that you want to add or amend, there will be ample opportunity for that. So any other thoughts or questions on that draft in January? Great. All right. And so last but not least, for next steps, I want to talk about not just our next meeting, but like what the meat of this task force is going to look like. And that is addressing these big, thorny, complicated questions around insulating severance tax from the general fund, around raising potentially new revenue. And so our first meeting, we talked a lot about sort of just the nuts and bolts of how this task force will work, sort of more clerical stuff. Today, we've talked a lot of background, sort of establishing the values and the like the outcomes of the programs that severance tax currently supports. We've all now got a baseline understanding, to the extent we didn't have one, of Tabor and how the state treats revenue across all these different categories, whether it's voter approved, General Assembly approved, enterprise. And so it's my hope that we now have this sort of firm footing to really launch into, some of these big questions around how we really meet the charge of this bill. And so I'm really, really open to this group's thoughts about how we sort of approach those conversations. I think one, since there are three distinct charges, which are essentially insulating severance tax from the general fund, paying back previously swept general or severance tax, and identifying future revenue. I think we can structure sort of separate conversations around each of those and maybe different groups of ideas around each of those. I think we can also choose to spend more or less time on those different categories, um, depending on, the pleasure of the task force. It's my candid opinion that paying back severance tax revenue is a really challenging um, proposition. And so this group may not want to spend the bulk of their time considering how to do that. Um, Folks can disagree, and I welcome that disagreement, but that is my candid opinion. Um, in which case, I would suggest that the bulk of our time be spent on identifying future revenue or insulating severance tax from the general fund. Um, the 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 ideas around insulating severance tax, I think those will be fascinating conversations. We've talked a bit here about how we treat enterprises, the restrictions on new. Thank you for coming, Doug. Sorry, Doug just had to take off. If for folks who didn't see that chat, we've talked here about how to potentially insulate or how the state might treat enterprise revenue. Um, Brian, you mentioned a statewide debrucing measure, which our friends from LCS told us has never happened before. Um, a previous report of a statewide debrucing measure being I think statewide being the key qualifier there. Um, our A previous report issued, I think in 2021, recommended that the General Assembly consider creating a trust fund that holds severance tax revenue. There are other states that manage severance tax revenue in trust funds that earn interest over time and are insulated. So there are options and different categories, I think, just within that insulate severance tax from the general fund category that this group can think through, and a lot of work, I think, that needs to go into thinking about each of those ideas. Identifying future revenue, similarly, different categories. We could suggest legislative enterprises. We could suggest ballot initiatives. I also think informing that future revenue need is a needs assessment. What is the gap we're trying to fit? What are the needs we're trying to address? Is there a gap? And if so, what is the size of that gap? On what timeline are we trying to address that gap? And so I think there's a lot of work on that needs assessment that's already been done in the past. What are needs for local governments into the future? What are needs for water infrastructure improvements into the future? And so I've just thrown a lot out there as far as what this group should be discussing. And I'm really interested in hearing everyone's thoughts on how we structure those discussions appropriately. I think it's been pretty easy to set agendas for these first couple meetings because they've been pretty linear, background, structure. But those conversations that I've just thrown out there are big, potentially thorny. And so I would love folks' thoughts on how we structure those meetings. And lacking thoughts, I will certainly do my best to structure them productively. But Brian, I see you're off mute.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on your assessment of our seeking and clawing back previously swept funds. Like, I'm not sure that's worth our oxygen. It strikes me that all of this, well, the first two or the first and third category um, are helped greatly by the needs assessment. And so I think if this collection of folks can come up with that needs assessment in a really compelling package, I think that's a beneficial thing no matter what. I'm struggling a bit with how to best navigate some of the charge here on, future funding and that, but certainly the needs and the future needs and what that, looks like is something that could be really valuable.
Yeah, and Nate, I think you already said this, but looking at what other states do and how they handle severance tax, revenues might be useful, just to give us some additional ideas.
Yeah, I agree, Steve. And it's my hope that a lot of the work that the research team is doing now and in that initial draft can at least outline the work that's been done in the past by the state on that front of assessing those future needs. And to some extent, helping us answer the question of how other states approach this.
Yeah, so along those lines, something that would be helpful to me is to get a little better handle of exactly what will be in that January 15th report. I know you've kind of outlined the high level, but maybe next time to hear more details.
Yeah, I like that, Steve. I'll note that down as something for the agenda for December. Eric?
It'd be really helpful, Nate, if you had like a time machine and we could go back to like some of the bumper years of severance tax and before our budget. I think that part of the challenge, well, it hardly bears saying, but doing this, in a year when there is, going to be probably a $1 billion plus, deficit again, or budget, whatever balancing measure, it just puts this whole thing on such a more, the footing is so much more on. You're not doing this in a vacuum, right? We're doing this, in the with the budget season coming up directly. So I think it's just harder to be, really straightforward and, oh, in a perfect world, you would do this and this and this, but we're not living in a perfect world right now. We're living in a world with, a lot of potential still, cuts to come, and a very difficult budget season, challenging budget season. So
Yeah, I appreciate that comment, Eric, and it does sort of bring to mind something that I've wanted to raise, which is that I do think this report need not necessarily be like a perfectly defined roadmap to future success, but an overview and an assessment of future needs and a menu of options for future policymakers to choose from to try to address that problem sort of as it presents itself. And so just throwing that out there that this group, you know, I think we can get ourselves a long way towards a menu of great options. But shooting for sort of the perfect roadmap to future sustainability of all these funding sources, maybe a tough ask. So
thanks.
Well, I'm noting that we are at the top of almost at the top of the hour. I do want to give an opportunity for public comment. Um, this came up a couple times already today, maybe more obliquely, but as Eric just said, we are still living this issue. The state is facing annual budget deficits. In the balanced budget submitted last Friday by the governor's office, there are proposed sweeps from the both the DOLA and the DNR side. So I believe 10 million for the next 2 years on the DOLA side and 5 million for the next 2 years on the DNR side. I want to make sure this group is aware of those proposals that are out there, and we're here to hopefully limit the need for that or eliminate the need for that into the future. With that, I would open it up to public comment if we have any. I know we do have a number of attendees on here. If you would like to offer public comment, please raise your hand and I will allow you to speak through the Zoom. And I'll just remind folks that there is a link on our website to provide written public comment as well, if that is a more comfortable option. All right. With that, I'll close public comment because we've not gotten any interest. And for the task force, I will send another poll, I'm very sorry, to try to zero in on a December date. I am out of the office for much of the rest of this month. And so, whereas we've met the first week of each month so far, I would like to target the second week of December, if that's workable for folks, so that I have time to prepare for that meeting adequately. And this discussion's already been helpful, but so please look for an email from me soon, trying to zero in on a date that second week of December, starting on December 8th. And if that absolutely does not work for anybody, please speak up. But otherwise, hopefully we can zero in a date that works for most. And then I think for December, I would like to target we can discuss this at our next meeting, but I'm thinking of whether it makes sense to schedule for before the CSU team furnishes us with a draft report or after. I think since we'll have some time to discuss that draft report in December, I lean towards after that report in January, but something for folks to think about between now and next month. Well, with that, I really appreciate folks' time. Any final thoughts? Looks like Eric has just offered one of those final thoughts. Eric, if you want to say it out loud, please do.
It's the right conversation right now, and I'm glad we're having it. It's going to be a tough year, but I really appreciate your time, Nate, and everyone's work on this so far, and look forward to leaning in with everybody as we go forward. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Well, in the meantime, I hope folks are able to schedule interviews with the CSU team. Also, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I will be around and available to talk through the end of this week. As I mentioned, I'll be out for the bulk of the rest of the month. But my email response will route you to folks who know what they're talking about as well. So, but otherwise, I look forward to our next meeting. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, guys.